Party for several years. She's been the leader since 2012. We're incredibly pleased to have her. Speaking second from the Conservative Party, we have Sir Alan Duncan. Currently, he is the Special Envoy to Yemen and Oman, and was previously the Minister for International Development. Speaking third, we have James Carver from UKIP. He is one of the MEPs representing the West Midlands, was elected earlier this year. Speaking fourth, we have Lord Richard Newby, who is the Deputy Chief Whip for the Lib Dems in the House of Lords. And finally, we have Mrs. Lynette Kelly. She has a doctorate from the University of Warwick, and she is the prospective parliamentary candidate for Leamington, Warwickshire in the 2015 general election. She's probably the seat that a lot of you, constituency that a lot of you live in. So definitely a great kind of speakers. We're very excited to have them here. And I'm pretty excited you're all here. Thank you for coming. For this event, we will have 6-minute speeches from each of the speakers, followed by questions from the floor, for as long as the speakers are able to stay, pretty much. We're hoping to finish by 8:45, in case anyone needs to know. So let me first welcome Mrs. Natalie Bennett.
Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here. My second young people audience in 24 hours. 24 hours ago, I was doing the Leaders live Twitter stream, YouTube, 16 different sorts of technology. I'm sure tonight is going to be just as lively, if not quite so many technological streams. And it's lovely to be in the West Midlands, which is one of our strongest growth areas. We've got 25 councillors now on 10 councils. And I'm confident that all of you here will be able to vote Green in the general election next year. I'm going to start with the depressing bit and get more cheerful, just as a warning, so you know what's coming. And the sad fact is, and I always feel like saying this when I'm talking to groups of young people, is on behalf of my generation to your generation, sorry. We've made a right mess of it. We've got an economic crisis. The fact that we had the financial crash in 2007 and 2008, and a couple of months ago we had the Bank for International Settlements saying we're closer to a financial crash now than we were in 2007. We have fraud-ridden, corrupt, reckless, overly large banks that still threaten all of our future. We've got a social crisis of inequality. What we've got, and there were some figures out today that are just demonstrating this, we have a deeply unfair, pernicious welfare system. Not just the bedroom tax, but the figures out today that showed in the past 21 months since the government made sanctioning welfare benefits much easier, 145,000 single parents have been sanctioned, have had their benefits cut. Single parents who have to buy the food, pay the rent, pay the electricity bill, have had to give up on some of those things, affecting their children. And yet when they appealed, 41% of those appeals were successful. It's no surprise we've got a society where so many people are struggling to get by. And then we've got the environmental crisis. Not just climate change, because that's the obvious one, the pressing one, but there's so many others. One of the facts that I think definitely needs more attention is the fact that the WWF came out with some figures a month or so back. The number of animals in the world, the amount of vertebrate wildlife, has gone down 50% in the past 40 years. We have lost half of the world's animals. And when you're thinking about that, you might be thinking of exotic things like tigers and whales, but think about hedgehogs. That quintessential English garden animal, they're going down 38% year on year for the past 10 years. And then of course we've got a political crisis. The fact that so many people are utterly disillusioned with 3 business as usual parties who haven't looked at all those previous crises and understood that they need real change, and are just talking about with tinkering with things a little bit around the edges. So I warned you I was going to be depressing to start off with. After this, I get more cheerful. That's the good side of things. Because the fact is, the status quo, things continuing as they are, is not an option. Britain is going to be a really different place in a decade's time. And we've got a real option, you, your generation, me, my generation, to build something really different. We can build a society that works for the common good, not just for the few. What we can do is make big multinational companies pay their way, not be parasites on the rest of us, but actually, a really radical thing this, pay their taxes. And I'll bet pretty well anyone in this room either has bought or had bought for them something from the website Amazon in the past year. The roads around here, today I'll guarantee there's been lorries running up and down carrying Amazon parcels. Last year, Amazon paid 0.01% of its turnover in tax. They paid no tax at all. We're all paying taxes to maintain those roads, and Amazon isn't. And it's also not paying its workers fairly, like so many big multinationals, not paying a living wage. And we say that the minimum wage should be a living wage. If you work full time, you should earn enough money to live on. And that's really not a big radical statement. In fact, about 70% of British people agree with that statement, just like about 70% agree with the Green Party in saying that we should bring our railways back into public hands, renationalise the railways. We need a publicly owned and publicly run NHS. The profit motive has no place in healthcare. And then, in terms of social situations, not only do we need to make that minimum wage a living wage, what we also need to do is say, if we're a decent, humane society, and we certainly, I think, do aspire to be a decent, humane society, we should be paying benefits to everybody who needs them. Not grudgingly, not making people feel like it's charity, but saying that we are all in this society, we all are only one medical accident, one car crash, one company redundancy away from needing some help, and that help should be there, and you shouldn't feel like it's charity. And then the environmental situation. Now, I often get accused of saying, well, it's a choice, economics or environment. And absolutely, it isn't a choice. We need to fix both of these pressing crises together. And that means things like the energy bill revolution. Insulate every home in Britain that needs it, lift 9 out of 10 households out of fuel poverty, create 200,000 jobs, and cut carbon emissions. It means renewable energy, the whole possibilities for industry to develop in Britain, tidal industry, solar, wind, all exciting possibilities. And then we need to tackle the political crisis. And this is where I could almost hand the microphone over to all of you, because solving the political crisis is in your hands. You've all heard, I'm sure, the Russell Brand message. To paraphrase, don't vote, it only encourages them. And I would say, don't do that. Instead, do something more radical and more effective. You can, all of you, everyone in this room, can create a peaceful revolution next May by making sure you're registered to vote, by making sure you go and vote. And the Scots showed us the way. They had an 85% turnout in the referendum. Just imagine if we had a general election next year with 85% of people turning out, as many young people turning out as over 60s turning out, and people voting for what they believed in, people voting for a vision of a better world. So that's my challenge to you. Let's get together and create a peaceful revolution and build a better society in Britain of the future. Thank you.
Party, Sir Alan Duncan.
Thank you. I'm going to try without the microphone, and if you can't hear, just shout and I'll pick it up and use it. You've probably done your homework on me, but just say that I finished being a minister in July by choice, and I can look back on 4 very rewarding years as the Minister for International Development, dealing with earthquakes, disease, conflict, Palestine. And I think there's one thing I am exceptionally proud of about this government. It's that we are the first major government in the world to have committed to spend 0.7% of our national income on international development and to have delivered it. I also say that I agree, at least in one respect, with what Natalie has said, which is please vote. Not, I'd rather you voted for Natalie than did not vote at all. It is a responsibility which people fought for, and not voting, in my view, is deeply irresponsible. Use your vote, and use it having thought about who you want to vote for. Obviously, my view is that I think you ought to vote Conservative. When I was your age, looked at this country and said it's going down the tubes. It's an economic decline. We're a post-imperial country with no future. We were treated as an economic basket case. My dog making funny noises there. So I've got one supporter anyway. And over the last few years, 40 years, we've tried to recover, and every now and then our economic recovery goes backwards because of irresponsible government. And what I want to do today is to urge you to think big. A lot of what Natalie says and what everyone on this table will say will to some extent make some sense and be appealing. But a general election is about picking a government. And what we risk at the moment in politics is dangerous fragmentation, where people will indulge themselves in voting for parties who are never going to form a government, and we end up having uncertain government. We are in coalition already. We have all the dangers of proportional representation without actually having the system. Let me just go through the various parties. Labour left us with a complete financial mess. We are spending 750 billion quid a year, but only raising in taxes 650. No one can live like that. And the pretense that somehow that is responsible stewardship of the economy is something the Labour Party needs to learn about and admit, rather than lead us into that disaster once again. Now UKIP, I have enormous sympathy for. When I was at school, we had a referendum in 1975. I was the vote no candidate. I actually wish we'd never joined. I don't like so many people in Brussels telling us what to do, when actually in the election we're leading up to next year, your vote will only count if you can elect politicians who retain the authority to take decisions and fulfill your wishes. But pulling out just like that would have enormous costs. But if, having won the European elections, UKIP say they were top of the poll on this issue, and you want a referendum, you are only going to get a referendum if there is a majority Conservative government. And the real paradox of voting for UKIP is that you will end up getting what even they do not want. So if you want a choice, be it to stay in the European Union or come out of it, you will only get it with a Conservative government. Now the Lib Dems, the noble Lord Newby, bravely coming here today, I'm afraid they're stuffed. They have spent 30 or 40 years being the party of protest, but now that they have assumed responsibility for government, their popularity and their respect has plummeted to a mere 7%, half, way behind UKIP, and a quarter of the Labour and Conservative parties. So the main choice is between Labour and Conservative. Now, I believe that the coalition has worked very well together. We have done what the electorate wanted, which was to turn the economy around. We've retained very low interest rates. We have the highest employment we've had for decades. We have the lowest inflation we've had for decades. We are the fastest growing economy across the whole of Europe, and even more than America. And without the stewardship and the decisions we've taken in government, that is not where we would be. Labour governments always run out of money. What they do is they say, I'm going to spend money on this, I'm going to spend money on that, vote for me. But what they're doing is taking other people's money, tax the rich as if it's a bottomless pit, in order to buy your vote and say, vote for me because I'm going to spend other people's money. And then the well dries up. And the new class war of supposedly capable Ed Miliband, in my view, is not going to rise. If you look at the two people at the top, it may be that people, of course, I accept this, have reservations about the Conservative Party in many areas, as people do about all parties. But if you look at the calibre of the leadership, whatever you might think of the Conservative Party in general, David Cameron outpolls Ed Miliband by a factor of 2 to 1 in almost every single poll that is taken. And when people go into the polling booth and pick up their ballot paper on May the 7th, one of the main things that is going to be in their mind is, do I want Ed Miliband as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? But I urge you to think big because of these 3 reasons. The first is our long-term economic prospects. The second is the need to retain the unity of the United Kingdom. And the third is to have people in government who understand that we are in an increasingly dangerous world, riven with conflict and threats. And for that, you need capable people. And I would urge you to realise that those of calibre and capability reside in the Conservative Party, and that your future is best guaranteed by voting for us.
Well, good evening everyone, and thank you so much. I think it's testament to the youngsters of today, because apparently you're not interested in politics anymore. Well, I'm delighted to see such a full room. Now, to my mind, the great strength of British democracy is its accountability. If we don't like what our politicians do, it's very simple. We don't vote for them. And we saw that in 1997 with the last major government, and of course more recently in 2010 with the last Brown government. But of course this premise doesn't survive whilst Britain is a member of the European Union, because increasingly more and more of the rules that govern various sectors of our country, how we govern our country, come in the form of regulation or directive from the European institutions. So that really is what UKIP stands for. It's an old-fashioned word which some people are almost embarrassed to talk about, but it's sovereignty. It's about giving you guys the ability to decide who is best for our country. We may hear during the course of the evening people talking about renegotiation. We hear what the Prime Minister says, and we can renegotiate and fight our corner. But if we're actually, at least on the continent, our continental neighbours are very honest. If we listen to what Frau Merkel is saying, if we listen to what President Hollande is saying, there is no ability to cherry pick the European institutions to force into our moulding. And actually, that goes against the whole principle of the European Union. Because it's actually very selfish to go to Europe and say, well, I'm sorry, we want the good bits, you have the bad bits. That is not how it works. You cannot go into any business relationship, let alone a political relationship, demanding such terms. And it's my contention that when Britain leaves the European Union, I believe that we will, we're actually going to get on a lot better with our continental neighbours. Because in 1975, when Alan voted no, my mother voted no. But of course, she voted for what was then called a common market. And since then, the European institutions involved, and there is one clear direction that the European Union is, if this is a ploy to get more votes around. To my mind, once we leave the European Union, we're going to be in a far stronger position, and we can actually decide rules. And if they don't suit us, it's very simple. The next government can change those rules to best suit the flexibility of the British economy. Now, I've just got off a plane. I was last Monday. I've just got off a plane from Strasbourg. I'm one of the 3 member to the European Parliament for UKIP in the West Midlands, who was elected in May. And we had a very interesting debate today. And I think Natalie and I will agree on one thing, that to my mind the European Union is about big business. What we're seeing is the multinationals, the people who are lobbying the 20,000 bureaucrats in the European Commission, and we don't know who they are. But what they're doing is coming out with regulations that are stifling our small and medium enterprises. And we've had a motion of censure from my group in the European Parliament today, calling for a motion of censure against the new President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. And this is because he attended all the various groups in the run-up to the election for President, and he made various promises to various people. He was talking about cutting down on aggressive tax mitigation. And Natalie has spoken about the corporates, how they're paying money offshore. You mentioned Amazon. Well, Jean-Claude Juncker, when he was President of the Grand Duchy of Prime Minister of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, negotiated very, very aggressive tax mitigation schemes with 140 of the world's largest corporations. And this was at a time when unemployment in the Eurozone, in Southern Europe, is in some areas 50-60% of youngsters are unemployed. And what he said as head of the Eurozone was more austerity, higher taxes, whilst not leaning on his own record where he spoke of offering tax mitigation scheme. So we had a vote in the European Parliament today. And I'm sorry, Natalie, you may not know this yet, but your three Green MEPs voted against that motion of censure. And the only British party that voted for that motion of censure was the UK Independence Party. And I'm very proud of that. To my mind, the living wage is not the answer. That is not the answer. What UKIP propose is to take the minimum wage completely out of taxation. And by deregulating when we leave the European Union, we could be in a right position where we can create and maximise employment. Because it's all very well having a living wage, but inflation, the cost of living, we all know about the cost of living. The cost of living goes up, so only by deregulating can we be in a position where we can move the economy forward without worrying about drastic inflation. Fuel poverty is another issue. We all know about the cost of fuel now. It's my contention, or my party's contention, but that is to do with green taxes. But of course we'll no doubt come on to that a bit later. UKIP believes in a future for our country. We believe in a future for our youngsters. And we have a radical message, because after 41 years membership of the European Union, we've come to the conclusion that Britain is better off out. As I said, we cannot negotiate the treaties to suit ourselves, and as a country that has given independence to over a third of the world, isn't it ironic that we're now seeking our own independence back? It's not countries that trade with countries, it's companies that trade with countries. And we need to be reaching out to our old friends in the Commonwealth. We need to be reaching out to the emerging markets, because GDP on the continent of Europe is the only continent where it is shrinking. And to my mind, to coin a phrase I used to be a mod from Paul Weller, who some of you will know, the world is a clam inside Europe, but if we leave the European Union, I believe it is an oyster. We've got to think big. Don't be scared by what Sir Alan said. We've got to think big. Don't be scared by what Sir Alan said. We have to look forward. We talk about financial debt. Well, what Sir Alan hasn't mentioned, I remember when the coalition came into power, their great promise was to pay off the national debt. Well, the national debt will have increased by 40% by the end of this term. We don't have the authority to really negotiate our way out of this debt crisis unless we have the ability to pass sovereign laws at Parliament. And you're right, Sir Alan. If you don't, if you don't like what people say, you've got to vote with your conscience. Natalie said, use your vote, and I say use your vote how you want to use it. Don't be scared to vote UKIP. Don't be scared to vote Green, because we both have clear messages. Because there's a tired old political system, and there are now UKIP followed behind by the Greens who are coming up the inside rail. And ladies and gentlemen, not since the birth of Keir Hardie's labour movement at the end of the 1800s? Have the British people been so ready for a change in political direction? And I hope by the end of tonight I will convince you that that direction to take is the UK Independence Party. Thank you.
What kind of society do you want to live in? Liberal Democrats believe that the freedom of the individual is the absolute centrepiece of a civilised society, and that if you are going to enable everybody to fulfil their potential, you have to have an active government doing a whole raft of things to help that. And that's why we in government have been, for example, skewing spending in schools towards poorer pupils, and why we've been raising the tax on lower income earners. We believe with Natalie that we're stewards of the planet. That's why during this government we've overseen a doubling of renewable energy since 2010, the largest investment programme in the railways since the Victorian, and why we've taken the lead in EU and UN climate change. We believe in sexual equality. That's why we fought for and achieved shared parental leave, better funded childcare, and more women in the boardroom. That's why we led and won the campaign for same-sex marriage, and why we're campaigning to end FGM at home and abroad within a generation. We're internationalists. That's why we want to play a full part in the EU. And that's why we've hit the 0.7% GDP payment in international aid. And one of our backbenchers, Michael Moore, is now making sure that we enshrine that in legislation. We believe that having a job is absolutely fundamental. That's why we put so much priority in turning the economy around. Why there are now 1.7 million more people in work than when we came into power. Why there are 390,000 children fewer living in households with no one earning. One of the absolutely key determinants about whether those children can escape from poverty and get a job themselves. We believe that the health service should be protected and that it should treat all its patients equally. And that's why we've said that we guarantee equal care and waiting times for people with mental health problems, the same as physical health problems, and increase NHS spending to fund it. We accept that there have got to be limits on immigration, that we need to start by having proper border checks so we know how many people are leaving as well as people coming in. But we also want to see more students from the rest of the world, and we want to see more people with skills who can help make the British economy thrive. And we pay tribute to the many immigrants who are helping the British economy thrive now, not least in the public services, and particularly in the NHS. And we believe that everybody has a right to decent, affordable housing at great prices, which has been getting worse over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's why in our manifesto we'll be committing ourselves to raising the number of houses per year towards a target of 300,000. So we believe that we have a prospectus, a liberal prospectus, which encourages everybody to make the most of their lives. So how does that differ, or does it differ from the other parties? Well, we worked with the Conservative Party during this government in order to primarily to turn the economy around, and we have turned the economy around. But for many of us, I'm sure I can probably, if not entirely, accept Sir Alan from this, we find many Conservative attitudes harsh. We find their view on Europe particularly damaging in view of what we see as our long-term national interests. As far as the Greens are concerned, I had the pleasure on the way up of reading the economy section of the Greens policy documentation on their website, and it may be that it's a partial document. But the single biggest problem facing us economically has been the deficit and the crisis of the public finances. And the word deficit does not appear in the Green Economic Policy document. It's not that they've forgotten about it, it seems. It's that they don't think that this is the central problem. And it is, sadly, the central problem which we've grappled with and have brought the deficit down, hard as it is, over the lifetime of this Parliament. I agree with Natalie, it's great to give everybody the living wage. But when I went recently to a factory, textiles factory in Leicester, staffed entirely by women of Indian origin, the owner saying, if we had the minimum wage here, we would move the living wage here, we would move all our production to Romania, where the costs of production are a quarter of what they are in Leicester. The difficult sort of issue you've got to grapple with is the balance between being very generous in terms of what people pay and how many people you pay. And it's a very straightforward trade-off. We have a minimum wage, which is very important, but we've got to make sure, in my view, that the priority is to have as many people as possible earning a wage and therefore making a real contribution to their own well-being as well as society as a whole. For UKIP, it seems to me that they very consciously appeal to the past and to people's worst instincts. Their policies on domestic policy are ever changing, and their view of people who are not like them, sadly, often verges on bigotry, and they are completely illiberal. The Green speaker talked about, for example, the trade in the Commonwealth as being the way out of our problems. Germany sells 3 times as much as we do to India. The idea that being in or out of the EU affects our ability to trade negatively, to trade with the rest of the world, is just bonkers. And we need to have, as we as Prospective, we need the maximum amount of trade with the EU and externally. As far as Labour is concerned, I just think they've lost credibility because they can't say anything about the deficit that people will agree. So, we believe that in this government, in very, very difficult circumstances, we have been able to help deliver an economic recovery and introduce measures of social reform which have been liberal. And if that's the sort of society we want, if you want a stronger economy and a fairer society, there's only one party to vote for.
Try this without the microphone if my voice gives way half through. Throw the microphone out. I thought I ought to introduce myself first because, unlike the others, I'm not as well known. I was drafted in at the very last minute. When I say last minute, Tuesday night, because the Labour MP who was supposed to be here doing all this bit was suddenly taken ill and she's in hospital. So you've got me because I live nearby. I'm in the Labour Party. You know, obviously totally qualified to do this. I've been a councillor in Coventry for 10 years and I'm now the parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party for Warwick and Leamington, where a lot of Warwick University students live, as you know. I'm originally from Coventry. I did my degree at Coventry University as a mature student and then I did my PhD here at Warwick University. I don't recommend that as a route to success. I started my degree just after my 3rd child was born, before her first birthday, so that wasn't the easiest thing to manage, and then had my 4th child in the middle of my PhD. I highly recommend that you get the qualifications and then do the children. It's far easier. Now, the Labour Party, we've heard quite a lot from everybody else, and actually if you listen to what everybody has said, there is something that you can agree with in what everybody has said. And I hope you'll decide that you can agree with more of what I said than them, but don't ever say everything about any particular party, even UKIP, they sometimes say something that you can agree with. So, we as a party, and I have to speak, I'm trying to speak for the party, and I will go off message sometimes because I am an independent person and I'm not an MP, so what can I do? We know that this society that we live in is not fair. It's unequal. Wealth is not distributed fairly. We don't all have equal life chances when we start out. And the reason I got into politics was because I recognise that inequality, and I want to change the way this country works. I want to change the way that things are organised so that people like me, who start off from very humble backgrounds, have the opportunities to get somewhere. They have the opportunity to stand as an MP. I was only able to get to this position because I lived under a Labour local authority that put money into adult education, so that as an adult I was able to go and get an A-level in sociology. I was only able to go to university because at the time you could get grants. And do you know what? You don't know what you're missing. You are leaving university in massive, massive debt. Now I know that, you know, soon after I became a student, loans were brought in, it was £1,000, then it went up to £3,000. There are arguments for and against that. The way that the loans were being repaid when they got up to £3,000 meant that reality-wise it was more of a graduate tax. You know, you didn't feel the pain of it quite so much. Now, £9,000 a year. My youngest, who is now 16 and in the first year of sixth form, he is really seriously saying, do I want to go to university? He's a bright lad, but already he's being put off education by the thought of carrying all that debt. Now, if you're from a wealthy background and your parents have been paying £20,000 a year fees for you to attend one of the public schools in this country, university fees are nothing. If you're like me and you've had to put your kids in state education because you don't have that type of money, I can't pay his university fees. I can't pay that £9,000. He's going to have to take out the loan, and then when he graduates, he'll be, what, 35,000 in debt when you take into account the living allowances? It's an unrealistic situation for students to be in. And much as my friend over here spoke eloquently, do you know what? They promised to get rid of tuition fees. And then they didn't stand up to the Tories when the Tories trebled them. And that's why the Liberal Democrats are suffering now. They made a promise that they couldn't deliver. And you should never ever do that. It destroys politics for everybody. Tell them that you're going to try and do something. Tell them that you'll try hard. Tell them what you believe in. But don't ever, ever promise to deliver something unless you know 100% you can do it. Because as soon as you fail to deliver, you have lied to the public and you denigrate all politicians in return. When you leave university, I want all of you to have the same chance as the person sitting next to you to get a good job. What we have at the moment in this country is growing inequality. And if you've got relatives in a big firm, you've got a much higher chance of getting an internship with that firm, getting an interview with that firm, getting your first job with them. But what about the people who aren't from that background? What about the people who can't do that? What about the people who don't have family in London that can put them up for nothing while they do an unpaid internship? We need to get rid of unpaid internships. We need to make sure that the recruitment process in all these big firms is fair so that everybody has the same opportunity. You should be judged on what you've achieved at university, what you've achieved at school, and not who you're related to. And that is something we seriously need to challenge in this country. On Europe, I could waffle on for ages if they would let me, but they're only let me have another 2 minutes. On Europe, you may have doubts about the European Union. Do you know what? If you work in this country, most of your employment rights come as a direct result of being part of the European Union. The Conservatives aren't going to give you workers' rights. UKIP definitely are. If you want protection at work, if you want the right to keep your job, even though your employer thinks, do you know what, I just don't think I want this person anymore, I don't like the colour of their skin, I don't like the fact they're pregnant, you need the European Union to protect you from arbitrary dismissal and make sure that when you are in employment, you are treated fairly by your employer. We've said that we want to freeze energy bills. and we're going to keep attacking the big companies. Well, sorry, they can take it. We have an unfair energy market at the moment that is not properly regulated. There is not quite a cartel, but it's a really bad situation where they seem to be able to put the prices up whenever they feel like, but when the price of gas and electricity comes down, we don't feel it. You maybe don't pay electricity and gas prices yet, but I do. And you know what? I am feeling poorer by the week because every time I look, I feel as if electricity and gas is going up. But in my household, well, I've been a councillor, so our pay's been frozen since 2010 because, you know, as somebody who's employed by the public sector, our wages have been frozen. Hundreds of thousands of people in this country haven't had a pay rise for years, and yet they're having to cope with a situation where the prices of basics of living are going up all the time. Food is going up, electricity is going up, gas is going up, fuel goes up most of the time, and then it goes down by a bit, and then they think, oh, they haven't noticed, we'll do it again now. I don't have the dog on my side. I don't know why, I don't know what to upset him. And he's completely lost my train of thought. So, what I will say is, you know, we were supposed to say why you should vote for a particular party. Obviously, I think you should vote for the Labour Party, but what I really think you should do is ask questions. Look at what the individual candidates in your area are promising and think about what would deliver best for the people in the area where you're living. Don't just be followed, don't just follow somebody because of one particular issue. Don't just do what I tell you or Natalie tells you or Alan tells you. Think for yourselves. You have got the right to vote, and that was a hard-won right, but you also have the right to think for yourselves and make your own mind up. So wherever you live, wherever you're going to be voting, think very carefully. Make sure that you register to vote first of all, because one of the things the Tories have done has made it harder for you to be on the electoral roll in the first place. So don't let them take away your right to vote. And secondly, make sure that you do actually vote, because if you don't, you lose your right to have a say on what goes on in this country. And I think that it's time that young people found their voice in this country. And if you vote in much higher numbers, then parties have to take much more notice of what you think, and they won't be so reliant on the views of pensioners. So, thank you.
Well, I think I'd rather vote for the dog than the three indistinguishable white males in the middle of the panel. But maybe if the Green candidate and the Labour candidate can tell us, like, what's the deal with minority parties? Is it worth, I'm not from this country, is it worth voting for, so I don't know your system, is it worth voting for minority parties and small parties in the system?
Okay, well, I very welcome this question because it gives me a chance, first of all, perhaps surprisingly, to agree with Alan. I agree with when he said think big. But I'm afraid, and this is very surprising for a man of his experience, that he utterly misled you about the voting system. None of you, unless you live some considerable distance from here, will have either Ed Miliband or David Cameron on your ballot paper. You are voting to elect your local member of Parliament. That is the parliamentary system that we have. Now what we have is a first past the post electoral system, which is traditionally, so the person in your area who gets the most votes out of all of those people will win. Traditionally, people have been trained in Britain to vote tactically. You vote for the person or party you dislike the second most to stop the people you really hate getting in. But that's given us the kind of politics we've got now, a failed politics. That's why my suggestion for the peaceful revolution is vote for what you believe in. And if we get, particularly young people, we get 85% of people out there voting and voting for what you believe in. And I'll admit that there's an ulterior motive here. There's a website called Vote for Policies, which puts the policies listed without the party name attached and people vote for them. And the Green Party is running on 25% in that Vote for Policies website. And I'll take that next year in 2015. And the possibility is there because YouGov did a poll last week that showed that if people think the Green Party can win, 26% of people will vote Green. And in this coming election, despite first past the post, 26% could win a lot of seats around the country. And that's how we could have a peaceful revolution. First past the post would then be clearly dead, and we could have what the Green Party's calling for, a People's Constitutional Convention to draw up a whole new constitution by the people, for the people, that works for the common good. Thank you.
Mr. Carver, would you also like to say something about?
Yeah, the reality is that if you live on campus, you live in Coventry South, you will get a Labour MP probably with a majority of about 6,000, 7,000, like we did in the next election. If you live in Coventry South, doing the protest vote and voting Green isn't going to make much difference to anybody. If you live in Warwick and Leamington, actually the choice there is between Labour and the Conservatives. We are very, very close. My view is we're slightly ahead of the Tories at the moment. Their view is they're slightly ahead. The reality is you need to think about who you want to win in that seat, because if you would rather see a Labour government, you need to be voting Labour. If you'd rather see a Conservative government, vote Tory. If you vote Green, you take away your voice, really, because Greens are not going to be big enough to win, and what you end up is what somebody else has chosen. So I would say think very, very carefully about where you are and why you're voting for a minority party. And to some extent, maybe you should be arguing with the major parties that they need to take on some of the policies that you think are important. But the protest vote after the election gets ignored. Sorry.
I don't think a Green Party vote is a protest vote at all. I don't agree with all the Green policies, but there are a whole set of principles there that people are going to vote for. The great problem with British politics is that votes don't count in general elections. All that counts is how lumpy those votes are. Natalie talked about dreaming of 26% in the general election. Well, I was part of the alliance when we did win 26% in 1983, and we got 23 seats. Labour won 28% of the vote, 2% more, and they got 209 seats. There is a rotten system of voting in this country, which has been there for many years. In this Parliament, we tried to change it, and a combination of Labour and Conservatives voted against AB, which isn't perfect, but it's better than what we've got at the moment. So vote.
Well, it's a referendum.
Vote with. There was a referendum. Yeah. But there was a referendum. But as often happens in referendum, it was in large measure a referendum on the government, and not just a referendum on the voting system. But you've got to change the voting system. But obviously individual parties in individual seats are going to try and persuade you to vote tactically for them. We do it, everybody does it. It's only common sense that they would do that. But if you feel strongly that you support any of it, you should vote for it.
What we've seen over the past couple of months is that UKIP is bucking the trends. People are saying, oh well, you can't achieve anything. I've been campaigning in by-elections where I've heard Conservative members of Parliament say if you vote UKIP you get ahead. And I've also heard, I've physically seen, I've got votes on my phone somewhere if someone's look at later, Labour actually saying vote UKIP you get Cameron. So, but what we have seen is that people are ready for change, because the Prime Minister, after Douglas Carswell took our first by-election win in Clacton, when Mark Reckless defected in Rochester and Stroud, the Prime Minister said we're going to throw the kitchen sink at it to stop UKIP. And look what happened. Well, with respect So Alan, perhaps you tell the Prime Minister next time he wants to put the sink in the bottle, put the plug in the bottle, because votes were hemorrhaging, and they were hemorrhaging not just from the Conservatives, they were coming from across the board. And what has proved on the back of our success in major European elections, where for the first time since 1908, a party outside the top two has won a national election. That shows that if you vote UKIP, you get UKIP. And do you know what? If you support the Greens, vote Green, because the only way you can get change, whether it's for UKIP to get out of Europe, whether it's Greens for a greener country, for a greener world, you've got to vote. You've got to vote your conviction. So please don't be scared, because politics is changing. You know, we have Caroline Lucas representing the Greens in Brighton, Kemptown, and we have Mark Reckless and Douglas Carswell representing UKIP in the House of Commons. So maybe it's time for change. And do you know what, ladies and gentlemen? We've just witnessed a very nearly an independence vote in Scotland. And it wasn't so many years ago that Winnie Ewing won that first parliamentary by-election for the SNP, and they all said, where's it going to go from there? Well, ladies and gentlemen, politics is changing. I may not agree with Natalie, but I look forward to shaking up the country, and the only people who can really win out of this are you guys and girls, the electorate, because by the emergence of other parties, we have to make the other parties work harder, and they can't take it for granted anymore. So at the end of the day, the only people who win are the electorates.
Any more questions? At the back.
So I have a question directed mainly to UKIP and the Conservative Party. So how would you substitute a £10 trillion market in the event that Britain exits the EU, in the event of a referendum? And what would you do in order to avoid losing all this skilled labor in the form of students like us in this room?
Okay, it's not about loss, it's about control. It's about being in control of your own country's wishes. That's the point. Now, I actually think that whereas UKIP started as a constitutional cause, saying basically something I'd agree with, which is that the European Union has developed into a massive organisation, which is not what people were told it would be, and that it makes too much of our law, has had added to it a rather nasty anti-immigration strand, which I think has become the unpleasant side of UKIP. And I think that immigration, if it is to be discussed sensibly, needs to be defined. Just talking about immigration doesn't mean anything if you break it down into the bits of immigration you're actually talking about. Do we want students to come here? Yes, we probably do. Do we want skilled people? You're just talking about them? Yes, we do. Do we want to import a lot of benefits tourists and sort of health service tourists? Well, no, except on terms which we are prepared to define ourselves. But going back to your point, just because you pull out of the European Union doesn't mean you lose a market. Now, there may be some dangers, of course, which is why I'm not in favour of unilateral withdrawal. But it doesn't mean that you then cut yourself off at all. It could have exactly the opposite effect, that because we are in control of our own destiny and don't have lots of regulations from Brussels, that everyone does want to come here, and does want to locate here, and does want to have their headquarters here. So it could go either way, or both ways. And it is not as clear-cut and simple as saying, if you pull out, you therefore go into isolation and cut yourself off. That is not what would happen.
Yeah, I have to agree pretty much. It's about having control. But let's remember, we have a huge trade deficit with the European Union. So it's in the European Union's interest to trade with Britain. We buy more from them than they do for us, and we can look at various factors that actually change the figures and suggest it's a lot tighter. For example, what they call the Rotterdam effect, where often you have goods being exported from the United Kingdom that go to Rotterdam, one of the largest ports in Europe, before being sent on to the rest of the world. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is treated as an export to the European Union, even though the direction it's heading in is often far, far away from Europe. So what this does, it brings clarity. What it also does is bring clarity with regards to trade. Because at the moment, and Mr. Allen Natalie, who's a Member of Parliament, Britain's trade deals, their trade negotiations are actually negotiated by the European Commission. European Commission for Trade does that. So whenever there's a meeting of the World Trade Organisation, Britain don't take that seat. That seat is covered not just for Britain, but for all 28 member states of the European Union by the European Commissioner for Trade. So it's about, it's often said that we'll have less influence outside the world, outside the European Union. Well, there's just one area, but we'll have more influence because we'll be able to negotiate our own trade agreements. And and with regards to this situation, these slurs about being an anti-immigrant, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, we have a very diverse party. No, I'm sorry, it's nonsense. I speak to you, and it's nice to hear the earlier question, and it was a dig up, the three white men sitting in the middle, from the guy with the Irish accent at the back. Well, I'm marrying an Irish girl next month, I'm delighted to say. Horror of all horror, oh my God, do I admit this? Of course I admit it, because I'm very proud of it. I had a Polish grandfather. Horror of all horror, oh my God, do I really admit this? I had a Romany gypsy grandmother. The great strength of Britain is its diversity. And we have we have various communities in this country that are British. So I say, please, let's get away from this kind of political British, because we're all British. It doesn't matter what colour we are, it doesn't matter what our background is, it doesn't matter who we worship, but we're all British. So let's get on with being British. Do you think that I cheer any less when, I don't know, what do I say? Do you really think I cheer any less when Paul Sankey scores a try for England? When Rory Underwood did it? Of course not. It's not about the colour of skin, it's not about your religion, it's about being British. So let's get away from this nonsense, because I think we've got a lot of strength in the diversity in our country, but what we need is control of immigration. Because one thing I learned during the European election campaign was how disenfranchised our own ethnic minority communities felt within the inner cities. Because a lot of these youngsters don't have the skills. And they're competing, against youngsters coming in from the European Union on unskilled labour markets and who would often work for less. So let's actually get this right. Let's welcome migrants, yes, but let's have control and decide who comes to our country.
I just want to come in very briefly and try and answer the question. First of all, if you're talking about people who come here from the European Union to work, there's two major things going on. There's, first of all, this country has failed to train enough people to do the skilled jobs that are available in this country. And so we're importing engineers from all over Europe. You only have to look at Jaguar Land Rover and the diversity of the employment, the workforce there to see that we do not have enough engineers in this country. And we've failed to meet that skills gap. We have got to do more to make sure that people in this country get the skills and qualifications that are needed for the industries that exist in this country. The other thing that's going on is we have people coming over through agencies that are recruiting outside of the UK. They're being paid at below minimum wage very often. They're being set up as self-employed to avoid the national minimum wage regulations. And they are undercutting the local workforce because of those various loopholes. And there's been so few prosecutions of people who fail to pay the minimum wage that it's a farce in this country. We need to do much more to make sure the national minimum wage is rigorously enforced. And talking about trade, if we come out of the EU, yeah, we could still trade with the European Union. But we'd be trading on their terms, on the regulations that the European Union sets for standards, and we would have no say in those standards whatsoever because we wouldn't be part of the European Union anymore. So we'd be trading with the same people, but we'd completely lose our say over the terms of that trade. I think it makes sense to stay in the European Union and have a say on what goes on rather than come out and lose any say on what goes on.
I want to entirely agree with you about the economic risks, but I think we need to go broader than that. I want to celebrate the free movement of people in the EU. The possibility for most people in this room to say maybe they'd like to go and study in Germany for a year or more, where you might not know there are zero tuition fees, as the Green Party calls for in Britain. To go and live in Paris or Rome for a year. And a fact that you might not know, but everybody should know, is there's an almost equal number of continental European people living in Britain as British people living on the continent. And you could swap those two around, which would create an awful lot of chaos in a lot of people's lives. but it will be utterly pointless. So let's celebrate and keep the free movement of people in the European Union. But just briefly, some other points to make on Europe. First of all, the Green Party supports a referendum on Europe because we believe in democracy, we trust the people, and it's now being put on the table, and we think it should be put to the people. And we've been campaigning in that referendum to remain in Europe because there are, first of all, wasn't that long ago that we commemorated Armistice Day. The EU has helped to give us peace, and that's not something to be discarded lightly. And then the second point, to keep the peace, and the second point to make is that there are decisions to be made at the right level. And I spent a great deal of time a few months ago defending the European Bathing Water Directive. And no one's eating, I think, so I can say this. We had lots of particularly Tories saying it's terrible where they're making these rules in Europe. These are rules about the amount of fecal bacteria in the water. And I think it's quite good to have rules about how much fecal bacteria there is in the water that you've got to go swimming in. And I also know that if we dump, you know what, on our side of the channel, some of it's going to end up over on the French side of the channel. So there are right areas to make rules. And it's not, and it shouldn't be, in the EU at the moment, we want a vastly reformed EU. And if we think about what we mean by reform, think about what David Cameron says and think 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So we're opposed to the proposed EU-US free trade deal known as TTIP, which would actually give the corporations even more control than they've got now. We've got to reform Europe so it's not run for corporations but for people. But we need to keep the EU together, working together. And the EU is us. We're part of it. This is people cooperating and getting together. So don't listen to the EU is doing it to us. Partly that's happening because David Cameron keeps storming out of meetings, taking his ball and running away. And if he stopped doing that and started negotiating, then we'd really have a way forward. Thank you.
But neither the Labour Party candidate nor the Green Party leader mentioned the importance of reducing the deficit, reaffirm what we already know, that neither of these left-wing populist parties have any idea how to run the economy.
Before we get to that, I've just got a suggestion. So that we get more questions in, I'm proposing that we have a 2-minute rule for each answer, and the gentleman who is giving us timings can have applied a 2-minute rule to all of us.
Like you didn't answer at all.
No, that was not my time. It wasn't my turn, it was the next turn.
I think it's your turn.
Apparently I haven't spoken for a while, so it's my turn, so I get to answer first. Do you know what? In 6 minutes, you can't say everything. And there's a whole lot of things I didn't mention. The Labour Party has talked about the deficit. Ben Miliband's given his speech. I'm sure you've read it, memorised it, internally digested it. You obviously don't like either party, I would say. His question was just the fact I didn't mention the deficit show that my party knows absolutely nothing about managing the economy. The answer is no, and in 6 minutes I can't give you every single detail of every single Labour Party policy. I spoke about what I, as an individual, think is important to me. Now, in this bit where you're asking questions, this is where you can get us to give you more answers about details of policy. But the fact that I didn't mention something just says that I felt that certain things were important. And the deficit is important, but so is getting rid of the bedroom tax. So is making sure that we regulate landlords so they can't evict people every time they complain about something not working in the property. So is getting rid of massive university tuition fees. So is creating a fairer society. So is making sure we stay in Europe and have a fair say on what goes on in Europe. There are an awful lot of things that are important in this country and an awful lot of things that the Labour Party wants to do. And in 6 minutes, I simply cannot say all of it.
I think you weren't really listening when I was talking. Just to briefly repeat myself, I said big multinational companies and rich individuals have to pay their taxes and have to pay their way. And have to stop being And no, I don't think the deficit on its own, it's a big problem, but it's not the biggest problem Britain faces. Our out-of-control, fraud-ridden, reckless banking sector and its dominance over the rest of our economy is the biggest problem that Britain faces. Now, in terms of how we'll deal with the deficit, we will have, and I think you're going to find that when we get to the manifestos next year, Labour and Tory won't have a great deal of difference in terms of their figures of what they're going to say they're going to deal with the deficit at. We will have in our fully costed general election manifesto, we had one in 2015, we'll have one next year. We will set out how we're dealing with the deficit. And the key to that will be, first of all, making rich individuals and multinational companies pay their way. And one of the other keys will be rebalancing our economy to support small businesses, cooperatives, strong local economies, and to support the kind of businesses that create jobs that people can build their life on. Not just a living wage, but no 0 hours contracts. We want to ban 0 hours contracts. Decent full-time jobs, not these endless 12.5-hour-a-week contracts and you have to work Saturdays, which is so much of our retail sector is. We need a different kind of economy, one that works for the common good, and that's how we'll manage the economy. Thank you.
I'm just going to chip in here. Sorry.
I think my Labour colleagues' comments on what's known as the Miliband defence. The deficit is the most difficult issue facing us, because unless you deal with it, it's not something that you can wish away. Unless you deal with it, you find, amongst other things, that interest rates rise quite quickly. And all the things that Labour and the Greens want to do, they're terrific things, lots more spending. You don't have the capacity to do it unless you get a grip of the public finances. It's just not a possibility. And in terms of how we're dealing with it, Natalie says we're going to clobber the multinationals and we're going to clobber the very rich. The multinationals, suppose you clobber them, but you're not going to clobber them to the extent that it's going to have a very, very significant impact on the deficit, which is nearly 100 billion this year. The money simply isn't there. And as for rich individuals, 28% of all income tax is now paid by the top 1% of the population. You can squeeze them a bit more, potentially, but they are very, very mobile, and they will go somewhere else. We have been more successful by spending a lot of money on tax avoidance in this government than the previous government. We've raised tens of billions of pounds additionally, and by working internationally, not least through the EU and the OECD, for the first time ever, we're cracking down on the loopholes that allow the Amazons of this world to avoid tax. And that's the way to deal with it. And you can't just say the deficit doesn't matter. It does matter.
On the economy, I agree with almost everything Lord Newby's just said. And look, doesn't it sound great? Vote green, flick a switch, everything's rosy. Life isn't like that. It is not like that. And this is a crucial moment, this is my point about thinking big, where you really need to trust the politicians who promise you less, because they're actually the honest ones. But Lord Newby's point about 1% of income taxpayers paying already 28% of all the income tax revenue received by HMRC just shows you who is paying the money. And if they go somewhere else, you've got a very, very different equation. So don't think that you can just say, we're going to get the rich, we're going to go on a rich hunt, everything's going to be great, it's all terribly unfair, vote for me, I'm going to solve it. It's not true. And that is what I think you have to be aware of.
To deregulate to get this economy moving, and you have to have the ability to rebuild. And as I said, UKIP will have a manifesto pledge to take the minimum wage completely out of of income tax, which is a great opportunity because generally speaking, people working on the minimum wage will spend that money there, will put that money back into the economy. We're going to abolish inheritance tax. We think it's disgraceful. Someone should pay tax all their life and aim to succeed, and when they do succeed, end up having a huge inheritance tax bill. What example does that set? You know, we're saying if you want to push forward and earn lots of money, pass something on to next generations, why should you be hammered by, quite frankly, this obscene tax? UKIP would introduce a 35% ban of income tax, somewhere between the top rate of 40%, which comes in at £55,000. We ran about sort of £46,000. People working on these salaries are the people who are actually creating employment for people at the bottom end of the wage market. Okay, that's all.
The world works. You have different consequences of politicians stepping in, trying to say, vote for me because I'm going to make everybody richer. It would not happen like that. You would have fewer people in work. People would invest in other countries. You have to look at the real economics and the effects of what would happen when things either become more expensive. I mean, for instance, we have a massive pension liability in this country because politicians over many, many decades have overpromised. The point now where people are being told that their pension is going to be less than was promised because it can't be delivered. And it never was going to be able to be delivered because politicians lied, because they over-promised on issues of economics exactly in the way you just heard from Natalie.
Okay, I just wanted to make one more point. I think